everyone! So today we'll tackle Constitutional Law 2, and the topics included in this video will be kinds and hierarchy of rights, fundamental powers of the state, due process and equal protection clause, the three inherent powers of the state, and sections 2, 3, and 4 of the Bill of Rights. So the primary source for this discussion will be from the lectures and cases of Attorney Bong Lopez, my professor in Constitu, and the secondary references will be from the Constitutional Law book of Bernas and De Leon. So we now go to the first topic. So we always see this provision even in Consti 1 and in Consti 2. No one shall be deprived of life, liberty, and property without due process of law, nor shall any person be denied the equal protection of the laws. This is Article 3, Section 1. And I think it's more of a guarantee for every human being, for every Filipino, that will be given due process, that we are protected by your laws, and we wouldn't be on the other side of justice when it has to be served. So what is the concept and the origin of the Bill of Rights? So we see in the screen, it's the hierarchy of rights. It's life, liberty, and property. So life is the pursuit of the pursuit of happiness. Liberty is our freedom, and property is our right to own or disown. So what is right to life and liberty? So the constitutional protection of the right to life is not just a protection of the right to be alive or to be secure in one's limbs against physical harm. The right to life is the right to a good life. So the emphasis on the quality of living is found in Article 2, where it commands the state to promote a life of dignity and guarantees a rising standard of living and improved quality of life for all. So what is life? It includes the right of an individual to his body in its completeness, free from dismemberment, and extends to the use of God-given faculties, which makes life enjoyable. So what is liberty? So it includes the right to exist and the right to be free from arbitrary personal restraint or servitude. It includes the right of the citizen to be free to use his faculties in all lawful ways. And life and liberty includes the following rights. So right to health, right to privacy, right to security, while the right to life under Article 3, Section 1 of the Constitution guarantees essentially the right to be alive, upon which the enjoyment of all other rights is preconditioned. The right to security of a person is a guarantee of the secure quality of his life. So the life to which each person has a right to is not a life lived in fear that his person and property may be unreasonably violated by a powerful ruler. Rather, it is a life lived with the assurance that the government established and he consented to will protect the security of his person and property. So the right to security covers freedom from fear, guarantee of bodily and psychologically integrity of security, and guarantee of protection of one's right by the government. So it also includes the right to dignity, freedom of expression and speech, freedom of assembly, and a whole lot more. So lastly, what is the right to property? So property is anything that can come under the right of ownership and be the subject of contract. It represents more than the things a person owns. It includes the right to secure, use, and dispose of them. So under the Civil Code, anything which may be subject of appropriation is considered property. So this includes real and personal property, whether tangible or intangible, and other property rights as defined under the Civil Code. So what are vested rights? Such as perfected mining claim or a perfected homestead or a final judgment. We also have right to employment, right to exercise a profession, protected property, although does not include mere privileges granted by the state. So a license to operate a cockpit is not considered protected properly. It is deemed merely a privilege withdrawable when public interest require its withdrawal. So sinasabi nga na, it's not our right, it's hindi to natin karapatan because a license is given by the government and it is regulated by the government. So the license to carry a firearm, yung LTAP, pag kukuha ka ng barel, is neither a property nor a property right. Neither does it create a vested right. A permit to carry a firearm outside one's residence may be revoked at any time. Even if it were a property right, it cannot be considered as absolute as to be placed beyond the reach of the police power. So lastly, yung right ba to public office, is it a property? So no, public office is not a property, but one unlawfully ousted from it may institute an action to recover the same, flowing from the de jure officer's right to office. While public office is not property to which one may acquire a vested right, it is nevertheless a protected right. So hindi man siya property, it's a protected right. So we go now to the kinds and hierarchy of rights. So we have natural, statutory, and constitutional right. So first, what is a natural right? It is the inherent rights. These are the rights inherent to a man and given to him by God as a human being. So an example of this is the right to live, the right to love, the right to be happy, and in statutory rights, these are drafted by the legislative branch. These enable the provisions of the Constitution. These are rights provided by the law making body of a country or by law, such as the right to receive a minimum wage and right to preliminary investigation. So ito yung nasa labor code natin. Yung mga overtime pay, ganyan. So lastly, constitutional rights are those found in the Constitution. To guarantee rights against abuse, the government protects these rights also. So example, it's the right to life, the right to speak, the right to travel, the right to privacy, especially those included in the Bill of Rights. So the classification according to the purpose in the context of the Philippines pertains mainly but is not limited to the civil and political rights of a person living in the Philippines by reason of the 1987 Philippine Constitution. So we also have these civil rights, political rights, social rights, economic rights, and cultural rights, as you see in the screen. So civil rights are the rights that belong to an individual by virtue of his citizenship in a state or in a community. So it's rights to property, rights to marriage, freedom of contract, equal protection, ganyan. Political rights naman are rights that pertain to an individual's citizenship. So the management of the government of redress, right to hold public office, right of an individual to enjoy a consequence of being a member of a body politic. So the right to vote, the right to public office, yun yung mga political rights. Then we have social rights or those associated with other rights which are intended for the well-being and economic security of the individual. Kasi economic rights naman are these rights to property, whether personal, real, or intellectual, like right to practice one's profession, right to make a living, and lastly, cultural rights are those included in our customs. Then next, we have the generation of rights. So may tatlo daw tayong generation. The first generation, the second generation, and the third generation. So we go first to the first generation. As you see in the screen, this is the description of what is the first generation. It's human rights. So basically, yung first generation daw, these are the no one shall rights. So no one shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property, yung mga ganyan. Yung second generation naman, these are the state shall rights rather. Yung parang nakikita natin sa Article 2 dun sa state policies, the state shall ensure yung economic living, the state shall promote youth welfare, those things. Then the third generation, these are also known as solidary rights. So ito yung mga bagong emerging na rights natin. So we move on now to the next topic, or the three inherent powers of the government. So paulit-ulit naman to, simula high school ata, alam natin to, yung police power, power of eminent domain, and power of taxation. So the totality of governmental power is contained in these three great and inherent powers of the state. They are inherent because they belong to the very essence of the government, and without them, no government can exist. The Constitution can only define and delimit them and allocate their exercise among various government agencies. It does not grant them. So, punta muna tayo sa similarities and differences ng tatlo. So, they said these three great powers are similar because they are inherent in the state and may be exercised by it without need of express constitutional grant. Then, they are methods by which the state interferes with private rights. They are necessary and indispensable in governance. They are as enduring and as indestructible as the state itself. They presuppose equivalent compensation. They are exercised primarily by the legislative. So yung tatlong yun kasi primarily legislative yung nag-exercise. So you see on the table that police power, there is public necessity and the right of the state to the public and self-preservation and self-protection. We can see on the table on the right side, these are the differences naman. So they said that police power, it's a public necessity. Ito nga daw yung pinaka-limitless, pinaka-demanding na power kasi it's exercised by the government for the general welfare of the people. While we have the difference from eminent domain, which is the necessity of the public for the use of private property. And in taxation, it's public necessity wherein they collect taxes for government funds. So we see now the differences here on the table, which includes the nature of the property involved when taken and the compensation. Kasi alam na natin sa eminent domain, di ba? It's another term for appropriation or condemnation na kumukuha sila ng property but not without just compensation. While police power kasi when they take property, it's the property is noxious. So parang distraction lang siya. It's usually magulong property or something na nakaka-distract dun sa society or sa well-being ng community, ganyan. So it's intended for a noxious purpose and such taken and destroyed. Pero kasi yung sa eminent domain, property is wholesome and is devoted for public use or for purpose. So parehas silang kumukuha ng property, pero yung sa isa, dinedestroy niya kasi nga noxious purpose. Pero yung isa naman, it's for the use of the public purpose. So, convert it into something that will be used by the public. While in taxation, property is wholesome and it's devoted to public use or purpose. Parang same lang siya ng eminent domain, pero iba lang yung means. And pagdating naman sa compensation, sa police power, it's intangible, altruistic feeling that the individual has contributed to the public good. Sa eminent domain, it's full and fair equivalent of the property taken. So maraming computation din sa eminent domain, but of course, it always goes down to kailangan just compensation yung marireceive nung natanggalan ng property. And in taxation, protection and public improvements instituted by the government for the taxes paid. So ito pa yung ibang differences nung tatlong powers. So it also talks about the scope. So in police power, the scope regulates both liberty and property. So yung liberty daw natin, nire-regulate ng police power. Pero sa eminent domain, and sa taxation, only property rights. So hindi sila pwedeng mag-regulate ng liberty natin. It's only the inherent power of police power. Then who exercises the power? Diba? As we said a while ago in the similarities, inherently na essentially legislative talaga yung nag-exercise ng power, but also upon valid delegation. We learned in our constitutional one yung mga test for valid delegation. So pwede daw yung police power ma-delegate upon valid delegation by the president, administrative bodies, and lawmaking bodies or the local governments. Tapos sa eminent domain naman, legislative din siya, but through valid delegation, public and private entities upon valid delegation, and sa president pwede rin, lawmaking bodies of the local governments, public corporations, quasi-public corporations, and administrative bodies. While in taxation naman, essentially legislative pa rin siya, but upon valid delegation, it can also be delegated to the president and the lawmaking bodies of the local government. So sa taxation, we have there yung nag-grant yung president ng tariff powers kasi kailangan i-regulate yung mga imports from other countries, ganyan. So sa police power, alam naman na nga natin to na through valid delegation, of course, or even our LGUs we experience here in Manila, that they exercise police power. And even through eminent domain. Pero note that sa eminent domain mo lang nakikita yung and private entities. So hindi pwedeng mag-practice yung private entities ng police power or power of taxation. It's only government yung sundun sa dalawa. Pero sa eminent domain, it may be practiced or exercised by private entities, but of course upon proper proceedings. So we go now to the next topic, o diba ang bilis? We go now to the next topic, or due process. So ito na nga, yung paulit-ulit na provision. No one shall be deprived of life, liberty, and property without due process of law, nor shall any person be denied by the equal protection of the laws. So see, we have a lot to talk about in due process. So first is judicial standards of review. So maraming test daw. Once it is determined that the due process applies, the question remains what process is due. It has been so often held by this court and others that due process is flexible and calls for such procedural protections as the particular situation demands. A precise definition of due process might prove constricting and prevent the judiciary from adjusting it to the circumstances of particular cases and to the ever-changing conditions of the society. To say that the concept of due process is flexible does not mean that the judges are at large, and to apply it and to all kinds of relationships. So, ano nga ba yung due process? Sabi ni Daniel Webster, it's law which hears before it condemns. So, it may be substantial or procedural. So, it applies to all persons regardless of race, age, or creed. So, it's applicable to juridical persons with respect to their property. So, the application is also extended to aliens, hindi lang sa ating mga Pinoy. So it includes application to means of livelihood or property right. So first, we tackle yung reasonable or rational connection test. So it requires only that there be a legitimate government interest and that there is a reasonable connection between it and the means employed to achieve it. So sabi nung profession namin, sabi ni Attorney Bong dito, there must be a reasonable connection between the purpose of the law and the means employed. So the purpose of the law has to be valid. For validity, it must promote public welfare. It includes public health, public safety, public policy, ganyan. So pag legitimate yung state interest, legitimate yung law. Pero if hindi valid, for in the first place, pag hindi valid yung purpose, hindi siya magpapass this sa reasonable connection test. Pag hindi nagpass sa reasonable connection test, walang due process. If walang due process, it's an invalid exercise of police power. And if it's an invalid exercise of police power, it's an invalid law. So sabi daw, to gauge here in this test, there are 4 ways. We have medical, empirical, scientific, and statistical. So yan yung sinabi niya sa amin. You can gauge it through these, if it passes medically, empirical, scientific, or statistical. Ito yung mga ways na pwede mong i-gauge kung reasonable ba yung or valid ba yung magiging purpose ng batas. So kung valid naman yung purpose, tas valid yung means employed, the practice of police power may limit the right, but it cannot prohibit, it only regulates. So second is we have the clear and present danger test. So whether the words are used in such circumstances and of such a nature as to create a clear and present danger that they will bring about the substantive evils that the state has the right to prevent. So ano ba yung substantive evil? It must be extremely serious and the degree of imminence extremely high before utterances can be punished. So, may sinabi si attorney rin dito, yung precautionary principle. So, when there is a good reason to believe that there is a threat or serious damage to health or environment, bias is created in favor of the ecology or health. The court may construe a set of facts to protect environment when there is a lack of full scientific certainty in establishing a causal link between human activity and environmental effect. The court shall apply the precautionary principle in resolving the case before it. The constitutional right of the people to a balanced and healthful ecology shall be given the benefit of the doubt. So, yung example dito is yung, ano nga pala yun, yung oposa versus factorial. I don't know, oposa nga ba? Yeah, it's oposa versus factorial. It's the case of the children that they were fighting for yung sa timber na parang it's gonna be harmful for the ecology and for the future generations, for their generation even. And yung court dito, yung Supreme Court dito, it actually ruled in their favor. And it sabi ng prof namin na it applies to this case. Ito nga, yung precautionary yung principle na hindi man it's a future event, but it has substantial evil. Yun na nga, yung illegal logging or yung pagputol ng trees, which will damage our ecology, and it will affect the future of those children and the future generations. So, yung damage, kailangan irreversible daw siya. So, if certain, may preventive measure dapat. So, kailangan maging uncertain. So, may elements tong precautionary principle. Kailangan may uncertainty of the damage or threat. If the threat is certain, hindi i-apply yung precautionary principle. We use precautionary measures. So, or precautionary measures or preventive measures. Pangalawa, there will be serious or environmental or health damage. So kahit uncertain, if it will not cause serious damage sa health or environment, hindi pa rin i-apply yung precautionary principle. And third, the damage will be irreversible. So kahit serious yung damage, kung reversible, hindi pa rin i-apply yung precautionary principle. So yung binigyan yung example dito sa amin is yung pagsuot ng face shield. Kasi uncertain naman talaga yung effects niya kung nakakatulong ba talaga siya. kung ano ba talaga mangyari. Pero kasi, yung damage that will be caused here is getting COVID. And COVID naman is not irreversible. It's very dangerous. I mean, you'll never know if you'll get healed or not. So, yung sinabi nga niya na yung precautionary principle, it may apply to wearing face shields kasi nga there's uncertainty, tapos may serious damage sa health, tapos yung damage will be irreversible. So, pasok siya dun sa tatlo, and it says na it's an example of using precautionary principle. So, the means employed and the purpose needs connection. So, ililimit ba if there's no connection to the purpose? Even if with connection, the connection has to be reasonable. Kailangan may basis, may empirical, medical, yung statistical, scientific basis. Something observed, something experienced or tested, or pwede ngang i-compute. If walang basis, walang rational exercise of police power, so hindi pa rin siya papasa sa rational connection test. Pag hindi na pumasa, invalid yung exercise ng police power. So it all boils down to these. We really have to familiarize even to the grassroots ng kailangan yung basis ng lahat ng nangyayari. It has to be reasonable. Kasi kung hindi siya magiging reasonable, possible na maging invalid yung law. So yung next na nga, yung clear and present danger, yung sinabi kong example kanina, substantive evil yung COVID, clear danger yon. In number coding, property right to, ginawa rin yung example to. And it's a valid law, number coding. So in administrative agencies, the rulemaking body, or we call this subordinate legislations, pwede silang mag-pass ng mga administrative rules and regulations. So, kailangan daw sa mga administrative rules and regulations, kung sa kanila lang naman kailangan mapaalam yung law, hindi na kailangan i-publish in the newspapers like our laws. But he explained that if internal rules, there's no need for promulgation. But if it affects public, it needs publication. So it will be discussed more later sa procedural due process. We go now to the third test, or the dangerous tendency test. If words uttered create a dangerous tendency of an evil which the state has the right to prevent, then such words are punishable. It is sufficient if the natural tendency and the probable effect of the utterance were to bring about the substantive evil that the legislative body seeks to prevent. And lastly, the balancing of interest test. So when a particular conduct is regulated in the interest of public order and the regulation results in an indirect, conditional, or partial abridgment of speech, the duty of the courts is to determine which of the two conflicting interests demands the greater protection or under the particular circumstances presented. So in short, kanino bang interest yung mas important? Whose right is more important? Whose interest shall be more protected? So it's right to liberty versus right to property. Right to property versus the right to life. So, kita naman natin yung hierarchy of rights kanina, diba? It's life, liberty, then property. So, in the hierarchy, fundamental rights are higher than preferred freedom. So, if religion or speech clashes using the test, this prevails. So, nagbigay siya ng example sa amin. I'll give it to you. So, si Susie entered into an agreement that she will work for Johnny for 1 year and Johnny will pay her 10,000 a month. After 3 months, she won the lottery. And ayaw na niya magtrabaho kay Johnny. So, labandera kasi si Susie. So yung ginawa niya, binigyan na lang niya ng washing machine si Johnny. Tapos, binigyan din niya ng replacement niya na worker, na labandera, si Johnny. Pero, nagde-demand kasi itong replacement ng 20,000 salary. So, sabi ni Johnny, sige, wag na lang. So, yung hindi naggumawa ng laundry si Johnny, hindi rin niya tinanggap yung washing machine. Hindi siya naglaba, so inubos lang niya yung damit niya. And nung ubos na yung damit niya, he wore the same clothes. So, nung pumasok siya sa office, medyo nababahuan na yung mga office mates niya sa kanya. So, he experienced discrimination, ganyan-ganyan. So, at the end of the day, inaccept niya na yung sinuggest ni Susie na maid. So, yung 20K salary, binayaran na yon. At the next part, si Johnny, sinunya si Susie for damages and for completion daw ng contract. So, pag-aralan sa oblicon, di ba, pwede kang mag-demand dun sa debtor mo. But anyway, yung sinabi ng court dito, sa damages, sige, fine, pwede siyang mag-file for damages since there is a breach of contract. Johnny has a right to contract protected by the Constitution. Actual damages, moral damages, suffered mental anguish, moral yung sleepless nights kasi nga besmirched reputation, yan pa yung sinabi ni attorney. So, yung pag-compel naman niya kay Suzy na bumalik sa trabaho, it cannot be. As we learned in Oblicon also, hindi mo naman pwede i-compel yung debtor mo to perform a specific performance. Kasi this will amount to involuntary servitude. So, the right to contract is a mere property right. So, yung right of liberty ni Suzy versus right to contract or property ni Johnny, ito yung nagka-clash. So, sabi ng due process or sa balancing of interest test is magpre-prevail yung right ni Suzy to right to liberty kaysa sa right ni Johnny to right to property, following the hierarchy of rights. So another example he gave was, si Leia, nag-apply siya ng work sa company ni Cesar. Tapos, in-accept siya ni Cesar on the condition na si Leia sasalin ng labor union dun sa close shop agreement kasi nasasali sa labor union tong si Leia. So, she needs the job, nag-agree siya. But later, naging close niya yung president ng union. Naging boyfriend ni Leia. Tapos, nalaman ni Cesar. Tapos, sabi ni Cesar, sige, tanggalin na lang kita, Leia, kasi bawal pala sa company custom nila yung may relationship. So, si Leia, nag-file siya ng illegal dismissal. So, may right to contract si Cesar in the agreement versus yung right ni Leia to association. Between these, the right to liberty will prevail. So, sabi ni Cesar, you waive the right, but Cesar clashes with the power of the state. The power of the state is to strengthen the union. I forgot pala na to say na kaya pala niya tinanggal si Leia. It's not just because na nalaman niya na boyfriend and girlfriend sila. It's because nag-dismember pala bigla si Leia kasi nag-break pala sila ng boyfriend dun sa union. Yung parang sinabi nga ni sinabi nga ni Cesar na kailangan niya sumali ng union in order to be employed to his company. So, ayaw na nga maging member ni Leia kasi syempre bitter siya na nag-break na sila ng boyfriend niya. So, yun nga, na-dismiss nga tong si Leia. So, yung sinasabi dito is yung right ni Leia to join and the right also not to join. So, yun na nga, property right versus versus right to liberty. So, yung close-up agreement, ina-allow naman to ng law. And actually, sabi ni Sir, mas sinusupport nga daw yung mga close-up agreement kasi it's a valid exercise because it promotes public policy. So sabihin natin bigla na yung religion ni Leia is Iglesia ni Cristo pala. So she's saying na sir, kaya lang naman din, it's not just because I broke up with the boyfriend with my boyfriend, yung president ng union. It's also because it's against my religious belief. So pumasok naman dito yung right to religion. So, yung sinabi naman dito, kasi it's also a case, I think Elizalde case, na sinasabi nga na yung right to religion, of course, it is above property right or yung right to liberty or even yung close-up agreement. So, of course, pwede siyang hindi mag-join if yung reason niya is yung sa religion niya. Tapos, yung binigay naman ni Sir, another example, what if yung sabihin natin, this department store specifically hired only puro INC. Kasi nga, hindi nga sila sumasali sa union. So, mas safe kasi walang union na, walang union na magiging kausap yung company or something. So, yung workers, gumawa pa rin sila ng union. Tapos sabi nitong department store, they're violating their religion, ba't sila gumagawa ng union? Sabi naman ni attorney dito, wala nang pakialam dun yung department store because it's already separation of the church and the state. So in my example a while ago, what if naman si Leia, hindi siya pinapayagan na sumali ng union ni Cesar, for example. Sabi ni attorney here, it's what you call yellow dog or it's unfair labor practice because yellow dog contract because it's unfair labor practice, hindi mo pwedeng bawalan yung workers mo to join a labor union. So actually yung mga employers dapat i-encourage pa nila yung mga close shop agreement because it promotes public policy. So now we go to substantive and procedural due process. Ito yung sinasabi ko kanina about the admin bodies. So substantive due process, it requires that for a right to be deprived, there must be a law which in itself must be reasonable. The legislative is directed to make laws and no right deprivation if there is no law. So the law needs to be reasonable. So what are the requisites of substantive due process? So there must be a valid law upon which it is based. The law must have been passed or approved to accomplish a valid governmental objective. The objective must be pursued in a lawful manner. The law, as well as the means to accomplish the objective, must be valid and not oppressive. So, the procedural due process naman, it's directed to those which hear and determine cases. Judicial bodies, courts, other admin, and agencies are given the powers to hear. So it serves as a restriction on actions of judicial and quasi-judicial agencies of the government. It's a guarantee of procedural fairness. Ano naman yung mga requisites ng procedural due process? So we have impartial court or tribunal clothed with juridical power to hear and determine the matter before it, jurisdiction lawfully acquired over the person or property of the defendant, which is the subject matter of the proceeding. The defendant is given an opportunity to be heard, and fourth, judgment rendered upon lawful hearing. So what we have to remember about procedural due process: impartial court, jurisdiction, right to be heard, and public hearing. Pero kailangan lahat yung sinasabi ko nga kanina din sa mga administrative bodies, they also have the right, they have notice of hearing. Kailangan ma-notify sila kung kailan yung magiging hearing nila, or else they will be deprived of due process. So the requisites nga is right. Yung sa administrative due process, the requisites here is the right to hearing. The tribunal must consider the evidence presented. Decision must have something to support itself. Evidence must be substantial. The decision must be rendered on the evidence presented at the hearing, or at least contained in the record and disclosed to the parties affected. The tribunal body or any of its judges must act on its or his own independent consideration of the facts and law of the controversy. And the decision is rendered in such a manner that the parties to the proceeding can know the various issues involved and the reason for the decision rendered. So if quasi-judicial daw, kailangan may notice of hearing. Hindi na kailangan ng publication like I explained a while ago. Kasi it doesn't involve the public. Kailangan pag involve yung public, dun kailangan ma-publicize. So, yung defendant dito, kailangan mabigyan ng notice. Kasi, pag hindi siya nabigyan ng notice, hindi siya binibigyan ng opportunity to be heard. So, pag sinabi naman dito, di ba bibigyan ng notice yung defendant? Pag hindi siya sumagot or hindi siya nag-file ng answer, it kind of results to waiving his right. So, parang wini-waive niya yung right niya. So, yung administrative bodies now, by filing motion for reconsideration and appear, na-cure yung lack to be heard. So, hindi daw enough na i-allege yung na-bias or impartial yung judge. Kasi, syempre, yung iba sabihin, bias or impartial yung judge. But it needs substantial evidence. Tapos, yung sa statutory due process naman, police power is inherent in the state. The local government units, dine-delegate lang sa kanila. If they exercise it, they should comply with the delegated rules. Diba nga, yung sa delegation of power, it's primarily vested in the Congress and cannot delegate more unless the constitutional allows. So yung permissible delegation is only through constitutional grant. So it allows Congress to delegate to 3 powers. To the delegated power, though it is no longer inherent. Sa Congress nga lang inherent to. So it must comply with the statute. Kasi nga, di ba, meron yung sa Constitution yung completeness test and sufficient standard test na pag alis niya dun sa Congress, kailangan complete na yung law, tapos kailangan sufficient standard na, tapos kailangan hindi naga-out of bounds yung magiging power ng delegated body. So he gave examples ng mga delegated power. So for yung sinabi niyang case here was yung sa Mangyan, sa Mindoro. So may provincial ordinance sa Mindoro. So it puts all the Mangyan in one area for personal care, for public safety, for public health, for public welfare. Tapos sinabi ng mga Mangyan na it violates the right to travel, the right to property of abode, yung due process nila. Tapos wala daw delegated power to practice. So the ordinance was said to cannot be, so the ordinance, sinabi nila na hindi dapat contrary sa law. It must not add anything that is not there. So there is no need for law if sa public welfare mangyayaring ordinance. To better explain this, he gave us the two branches of general welfare clause. So we have the general legislative power and the police power proper. So yung general legislative power daw, yung mga LGU, pwede sila mag-enact ng ordinances in order to implement the Constitution, yung statutes, yung state policies, yung projects. So here, sa general legislative power, there has to be a law to implement the ordinance. So it must not be contrary to the Constitution, the law, public morals, etc. So the LGU here is acting as an agent of the state. So they act as a territorial and political agency of the state. So they are the implementer of the laws. While in police power proper, the LGUs enact ordinances in order to promote public safety, public health, public morals, the general welfare, the comfort and convenience of the inhabitants or their constituents. So here daw, yung LGU is acting as an agent of their inhabitants. So hindi na kailangan mag-base sa law. There is no need for law to exercise this power. They can enact ordinances for the welfare of the inhabitants. So, kung wari, yung Congress nagpass ng law prohibiting smoking in public buildings. Tapos yung Makati City nag-prohibit ng smoking in public buildings and open spaces. So, valid ba yung ordinance na yon? So, yes, sabi dito, valid daw yung ordinance kasi in-expand lang ng Makati City yung batas na meron ng pinasa ng Congress. So, what if yung may law tayo na pinas naman na prohibiting smoking in public building. Tapos yung Makati pass an ordinance allowing smoking in public buildings. Di ba nga sabi kanina, kailangan hindi contrary to the Constitution, to the statute. So, basically, this ordinance will be invalid kasi contrary siya dun sa law na nagpro-prohibit ng smoking in public buildings. So, what if yung Makati binan yung smoking in public buildings? Pero walang statute na nagpro-prohibit dito. Walang pinas yung Congress na bawal mag-smoke sa public buildings. Is the ordinance valid? The ordinance is valid under yung sinabi natin kanina, yung police power proper. Kasi, Makati City is promoting public health by prohibiting smoking. So, it's a practice of police power proper. Paano naman kung yung Congress passed a law prohibiting gambling but allowed certain forms of gambling? So, in LGUs and local governments allowed to operate cockpits, the LGU has the power to regulate. So, the part of the power is to decide how many cockpits are allowed for operations. So, sinabi nga na kahit pinagbabawal yung gambling in general, they allowed certain types, but it can be regulated by the local government units. But lastly, last example, what if nagpro-prohibit nga yung law ng gambling but allowing casinos granting yung franchise na kailangan i-regulate ng state natin. So PAGCOR nag-enter daw into a contract with a certain hotel. Tapos yung Makati City, pinrohibit yung gambling in the whole city. So itong certain hotel, kinestyon kasi sinabi, bakit ganon? So yung Supreme Court ruled na invalid yung ordinance because it is contrary to the Legislative Act. They cannot pass an ordinance contradicting the statute. So katulad dun ng example kanina. So yung kine-question dito, yung kine-question naman dito nung ibang petitioners is if gambling is moral, immoral naman daw yun. So ito, sinabi naman ng court dito, it's already a political question and it's not a justiciable question. In the exercise of police powers, when the state limits a person's right, it is for the general welfare. So yung sa administrative due process na sinasabi ko kanina, di ba kailangan may right to hearing, evidence substantial, and the tribunal or the body or any of its judges must act on its or his own independent consideration of the law. So, kailangan natin alalahanin na pag sa administrative due process, hindi na to kailangan na malaman ng buong, hindi na to kailangan ma-publicize. And they follow their own internal rules. But, of course, they should comply with the requisites of administrative due process. So we go now to the Equal Protection Clause. So all persons or things similarly situated must be similarly treated both as to the rights conferred and the responsibilities imposed. It does not demand absolute equality. So ano ba yung equality? Equality is treating all people equally if they are similarly situated. If they are not similarly situated and they are treated the same, that is inequality. So yung sinabi ni attorney dito is, what if you tax everyone 50,000 annually? Siyempre hindi equal yun kasi iba-iba naman yung earning capacity ng tao. Siguro para kay nila NBC, pareha lang yung 50K. Pero paano naman sa ating mga middle class or hamak na worker lang, di ba? So when the law classifies, it means the means employed is police power. The classification must be to promote the general welfare. The state cannot classify just because gusto niya lang. So yung general welfare nga, paulit-ulit tayo, di ba? State interest, public policy, public health, public ganyan, yung environment. So the means employed must be reasonably connected to the purpose of the law. So babalik tayo na kailangan pumasok pa rin siya dun sa reasonable yung means to the purpose of the law. There is no difference between a law which actually denied equal protection of the law and a law which permits of such denial. A law may appear to be fair in its face and impartial in appearance, yet if it permits of unjust and illegal discrimination, it is within the constitutional prohibitions. The clause also commands the state to pass laws which positively promote equality or reduce existing inequalities. All persons subject to legislation should be treated alike under like circumstances and conditions, both in privileges conferred and liabilities imposed. So what are the requisites for valid classification? So ano ba yung classification? It means the grouping of persons or things similar to each other in certain particulars and different from all others in the same particulars. So such classification now rests upon substantial distinction. This is the first one. If distinguished according to age, for example, it depends on the purpose of the law. What makes the distinction substantial if there is reasonable connection to the purpose of the law? So example, sa age nga, all children are not allowed to eat ice cream. So ano ba yung children sa law natin? Those 18 below. Kasi 18 yung majority age natin, di ba? So is this law substantial? No. So kasi wala namang reasonable connection or wala namang it doesn't rest on substantial distinctions. So another example, sa age pa rin, all minors are not allowed to watch R-rated films, but the adults can. So is the law valid? It is, because the purpose of the law is to protect morality and it is therefore lawful. The second requisite is it applies equally to all members of the same class. Ito medyo naguluhan kami dito sa example na to. We didn't get it correctly. So, sabi, may cultural revolution in China. Tapos, may nagtitrade tayo, di ba? So, yung may Filipino first policy tayo, like we knew from the, what's that case? Manila Prince Hotel na case. Tapos sabi dito, nag-pass daw yung Congress kasi nga masyado nang lumalakas yung yung trading ng China. Nag-pass yung Congress prohibiting yung Chinese to import their products in the Philippines. So valid ba to? So yung sinabi nga dito, there is no distinction sa Chinese and sa other nationalities. So ba't mo i-prohibit just them? They are similarly situated with other foreign nationals in our country. So therefore, it violates the equal protection clause. Kasi nga 'di ba sinabi na our due process and equal protection, it extends even to the aliens. So yung retail nationalization law, it's also prohibiting non-Filipino to trade. So valid ba 'yon? So hindi nga daw. Third is it is germane to the purposes of the law. And what makes the distinction substantial is that kailangan yung distinction germane to the purpose of the law. So kailangan how do you explain germane? Important siya, kailangan relevant siya dun sa purpose ng law. So for example, sa gender, sa sex, so male versus female, sa maternity leave, may distinction doon kasi kinagrant lang yung maternity leave malamang sa women kasi tayo lang naman yung nabubuntes. So yung substantial ba yung distinction? Yes. So valid ba yung germane ba yung purpose dun sa law? So the law's purpose is to promote public policy. It's for the women. It's under our constitution as well to protect the women, to promote the general welfare of the women. So it is valid because it is germane to the purpose of the law. And lastly, it is not confined to existing conditions only. So we have judicial standards of review. We have the rational basis scrutiny, intermediate scrutiny, and strict scrutiny. So yung rational basis test, it is the traditional test which requires only that government must not impose differences in treatment except upon some reasonable differentiation fairly related to the object of regulation. Simply put, it merely demands that the classification in the statute reasonably relates to the legislative purpose. The guarantee of the equal protection of the laws is not violated by the legislation based on reasonable classification. This standard of review is typically quite differential. Legislative classifications are presumed to be valid largely for the drawing of lines that created distinctions in peculiarity, a legislative task and unavoidable one. So laws or ordinances are upheld if they rationally further a legitimate government interest. In intermediate strict scrutiny test naman, it requires that the classification or the means must serve an important governmental objective or the means to the ends and is substantially related to the achievement of such objective. A classification based on sex is the best established example of an intermediate level of review. It is also used for evaluating classifications based on legitimacy. And lastly, the strict scrutiny test. It requires that the classifications serve a compelling state interest and is necessary to achieve such interest. This level is used when suspect classifications or fundamental rights are involved. Under this test, the focus is on the presence of compelling rather than substantial governmental interest and on the absence of less restrictive means for achieving the interest, and the burden befalls on the state to prove the same. It is applied when the challenge statute either classifies on the basis of an inherently suspect characteristics or infringes fundamental constitutional rights. So we go now to police power. Kanina sinabi na natin yung similarities and yung differences ng tatlong inherent powers, and now we tackle them one by one. So what is police power? The power of police power is the power of promoting public welfare by restraining and regulating the use of liberty and property. So it limits our rights. It is the most essential, insistent, and less limitable of powers, extending as it does to all great public needs. So yung Constitution daw, it limits this power. So kasi syempre minsan may corruption diyan and absolute corruption of power. So nire-restrict ng ating Constitution. So what are the elements of police power? It is yung number one, it is an imposition of restraint upon liberty or property. Second, the power is exercised for the benefit of the common good. So it limits the person's right to promote general welfare, like we said a while ago. So it is dynamic, it's not static, and must move with the moving society it is supposed to regulate. Once exercised, it is not deemed exhausted and may be exercised again and again as often as it is necessary for the protection or the promotion of public welfare. So yung mga scopes niya, it cannot be bargained away through the medium of treaty or contract. Taxing power may be used to implement this police power. So yung police power, pwede rin niya implement yung taxing power. So the eminent domain may also be used to implement or attain police power. So non-impairment of contracts or vested rights will have to yield to superior and legitimate exercise of police power. And exercise of profession may be regulated by the state to safeguard health, morals, peace, education, order, safety, and several welfare of the people. So yung requisites niya is there is a lawful subject and a lawful means. So yung lawful subject now is the subject of the measure is within the scope of police power. For example, that activity or the activity or property sought to be regulated affects the public welfare. The interest of the public generally, as compared to a particular class, requires interference by the state. Yung lawful means naman, it means that the means employed are reasonably necessary for the accomplishment of the purpose and not duly oppressive upon individuals. It both the end and the means must be legitimate. So what is the basis in fundamental legal principles? So the law of overruling necessity, that the will of the people is the supreme law, that the use of your property as to not to injure the property rights of others. And ano naman yung maglilimit sa exercise ng police power? We have the due process clause, the equal protection clause, and generally, yung Bill of Rights. And yung additional limitations, it also includes pag expressly granted by the law within territorial limits, and it must not be contrary to law. Kasi pag contrary to law yung practice of police power, of course, it is limited. So who may exercise police power? In-explain na natin kanina, it is lodged primarily in the legislature. Tapos pwede nyo i-delegate sa president, administrative bodies, lawmaking bodies. And bakit ito yung pinaka less limitless, insistent? So bakit siya superior? So kasi we have contractual rights, treaty rights, property rights, which is they all yield to the police power. Kasi nga, yung police power, as we continuously say again and again, na pinopromote niya yung common good, yung general welfare. So, everything else must yield to the practice of police power. So, paano nagiging implement of police power yung eminent domain? So, the mandated confiscation of all covered lands held beyond private retention limits is compensable as it partakes the nature of expropriation. And yet, this kind of expropriation is intended for the benefit not only of a particular community or of a small segment of the population, but of the entire Filipino nation, from all levels of our society, from the impoverished farmer to the land glutted or owner. Its purpose does not cover only the whole territory of this country, but goes beyond in time to the foreseeable future, which it hopes to secure and edify with the vision and the sacrifice of the present generation of Filipinos. It is for this reason that the exercise of eminent domain becomes an implement of police power. Yung taxation naman, taxation may be used as an implement of police power when the tax is levied for a regulatory purpose to provide means for the rehabilitation and stabilization of a certain industry, like the threatened sugar industry. Such industry is one of the greatest industries of our nation, the promotion, protection, and advancement of which greatly redounds to the general welfare. Hence, it was competent for the legislature to find that the general welfare demanded that such industry should be stabilized. In turn, the whole everyone in the wild field of its police power, the lawmaking body could provide that the distribution of the benefits therefrom be readjusted among its components to enable it to resist the added strain of increase in taxes that it had to sustain. So, ito nga, parang practice of police power din siya. So, lagi lang tandaan sa police power, it always goes down to promoting the general welfare, the public welfare. So, it's the exercise of our government in order to create a state that is functioning in a way that no one shall be deprived of anything, but at the same time it can limit even our rights to liberty if that limitation will be for the good of the public. We go now to eminent domain. So the right of eminent domain is the ultimate right of the sovereign power to appropriate not only the public but the private property of all citizens within the territorial sovereignty to public purpose. So the two mandatory requirements should underlie the government's exercise of the power of eminent domain. First, that it is for a particular public purpose. And second, that just compensation be paid to the property owner. So, an ejectment suit, nagpe-prevail ba yon sa eminent domain? So no, because it will not prevail over this inherent power of the state. Being inherent, it need not be lodged or specifically conferred on government because it is conferred by the Constitution. Article 3, Section 9 of the Constitution merely imposes a limit on the government's exercise of the power. So note that the eminent domain is different from police power. Police power implies a temporary taking of a private company's operation and business, so ownership is not transferred. Yung sa eminent domain, it is. Kasi nga, kaya nga binabayaran, kaya may just compensation. So Article 3, Section 9 of the Constitution states that private property shall not be taken for public use without just compensation. So towards this end, the state shall ensure that owners of real property acquired for national government infrastructure projects are promptly paid just compensation. Actually, chika ko lang, yung PNR here, sa Antipolo Street, ginagawa ngayon. And I was talking to my chairman friends and they were telling me na I think two of them, na natanggal yung barangay, almost a lot of houses. Pero yung government, even just dun sa barangay nila, yung barangay hall nila mismo they were paid, I don't know, I don't want to say yung the amount, but at least parang sabi ko, oh, tama lang naman din yun. And dito ko rin, I mean, first-hand experience yun na niya, of course, kailangan tumupad na yung wala nga matitake na private property or yung property na will be for public use without just compensation. Kasi nasagasaan yung barangay hall nila na gagawin ng PNR. So yun, yung binigay na sa kanila na money, it's gonna be used to build a new barangay hall. So who may exercise this? Sinabi na nga natin kanina, Congress primarily, but other governmental and private entities by delegation. So yung President, various local legislative bodies, certain public corporations, quasi-public corporations, yun nga, National Railways, PLDT, Meralco. So power is dormant until the legislature sets in motion. Once authority is given to be exercised, the matter ceases to be wholly legislative. The constitutional limitation nga is set in this provision in Article 3, Section 9. So, ano ba yung requisites ng eminent domain? First, we have taking, private property for public use, payment of just compensation, and delegation to administrative bodies. So first, we tackle yung taking. Ano yung requisites ng taking? The expropriator must enter a private property. The entry must be for a momentary period. The entry must be under warrant of legal authority. The entry is for public use, and the owner is deprived of enjoying his property. If the taking is under police power, it is not compensable. So walang just compensation. So wala daw just compensation sa police power. So the essential elements, basically, to sum it all up, in taking of the property under the power of eminent domain, it is the entrance and occupation by the condemnor upon the private property for more than a momentary period, and devoting it to a public use in such a way as to oust the owner and deprive him of all beneficial enjoyment of the property. And parang dideprive mo talaga siya ng paggamit ng property niya. Kaya kailangan mo siyang i-compensate. So to successfully invoke the exercise of police power, not only must it appear that it is for the interest of the public generally, as distinguished from those of a particular class, it requires an interference with the private rights. But the two means employed must be reasonably necessary for the accomplishment of the purpose, and it's not duly oppressive. So may two kinds of taking daw. Merong possessory taking and the regulatory taking. So yung regulatory taking occurs when the government's regulation leaves no reasonable, economically viable use of the property, as dun sa case ng City of Manila versus Judge Lago. Interesting case. So, the threshold requisites for a lawful taking of private property for public use are the necessity for the taking and the legal authority to effect the taking. So, kailangan talaga may necessity sa taking. Tapos, kailangan, syempre, may legal authority ka into taking the property. Second is private property. So in general rule, anything that come under the dominion of man is subject to expropriation. What are exceptions? Money and personal right is not reduced into possession. The right to bring an action to recover debt, money, or a thing. So private property already devoted to public use cannot be expropriated by a delegate acting under a general grant of authority. So waterworks system is case na to, Baguio versus Nawasa, sinasabi na yung waterworks system doon is patrimonial property of the city and being owned by a municipal corporation, ginagamit na nga siya for public use, it cannot be taken away anymore under the power of eminent domain. If the property is owned by the municipality, meaning municipal corporation, sabi nga sa case na to, it is public and it has governmental capacity. The property is public and Congress has absolute control over it. But if the property is owned in its private or proprietary capacity, then it is patrimonial and Congress has no absolute control. So the capacity in which the property is held, however, is dependent on the use to which it is intended and devoted. So third naman, we go to for public use. Ano yung public use? It is whatever may be beneficially employed for the general welfare, including both direct or indirect benefit or advantage to the public. So it said na yung for condemnation purposes, public use is one which confers same benefit or advantage to the public. It is not confined to actual use by the public. It is measured in terms of right of public to use proposed facilities for which condemnation is sought, and as long as the public has the right of use, whether exercised by one or many members of the public, a public advantage or public benefit accrues sufficient to constitute the public use. The idea that public use is strictly limited to clear cases of use by the public has long been discarded. This is in the case of Manosca versus Court of Appeals. Very interesting case also. I think this was the case na yung kung saan ata pinanganak si Manalo, the founder of Iglesia, they said na parang magiging, I think, parang tatayuan yun ng historic something. Tapos parang yung Manosca, yung mga may-ari, yung sinasabi na may-ari ng lot, they were saying na it's not gonna be for public use kasi parang yung mga INC members lang naman yung gagamit. Pero yung sinabi ng court nga dito na hindi naman porket itong certain sector lang yung gagamit, hindi na siya for public use. So it's also considered for public use. So yung sinabi nga dito, the idea that public use is strictly limited to clear cases of use by the public, na discard na daw yun. So as long as it is for a public use, it can be an exercise of eminent domain. So, when the land has been acquired for public use in fee, simple, unconditionally, either by the exercise of eminent domain or by purchase, the former owner retains no rights in the land, and the public use may be abandoned or the land may be devoted to a different use without any impairment of the estate or title acquired or any reversion to the former owner. Pero sinabi ni attorney dito na kailangan continuous na yung property which was condemned by through the power of eminent domain, kailangan continuous na it's used for public use. So fourth is we go to payment of just compensation. Ano ba yung just compensation? So just compensation is fair and full equivalent payment for the loss sustained, which the measure of the indemnity, not whatever gain, would accrue to the expropriating agency. It is not the market value per se. So where only part of the property is expropriated. So for example, yung Nawasa, hindi naman i-expropriate yung buong property, kailangan lang nila ng right of way. So the entitlement of the people that will be compensated here is two consequential damages, if any, plus consequential benefits must be deducted from the total compensation, provided consequential benefits does not exceed consequential damages. Gosh, so much math. But anyway, the payment of, so kailangan daw dito, yung payment of the correct amount plus payment within a reasonable time. So ano daw ba yung reasonable time? It says na, I think the reasonable time is 5 years. Tama ba? Yeah, yung 5-year rule. The non-payment of the compensation does not entitle the private landowner to recover possession of the expropriated lots. However, in cases where the government failed to pay the compensation within 5 years from the finality of the judgment in the expropriation proceedings, the owner concerned shall have the right to recover possession of the property. This is in connection with the principle that the government cannot keep the property and dishonor the judgment. To be sure, the 5-year period limitation will encourage the government to pay just compensation punctually. So, ano ba yung ibang kailangan na rules? So, yung non-payment of just compensation, yung general rule naman dito, Non-payment by government does not entitle private owners to recover possession of the expropriated property, but only to demand payment of the fair market value of the property. Tapos, yung entitlement naman sa interest, yung general rule is when there is delay, obligor, there must be interest by way of damages. Yung exception naman is when the right is waived by not claiming the interest. Tapos, yung pag-transfer naman ng title, payment of just compensation, kailangan mauna yon bago ma-transfer yung title dun sa nag-expropriate na agency. This what is the kind of compensation? So it has to be money. But I think in one case, in Association of Small Landowners versus Secretary of Agrarian Reform, payment is allowed to be made partly in bonds because it deals with a revolutionary kind of expropriation. So, yon. The purpose of just compensation is not to reward the owner for the property taken, but to compensate him for the loss thereof. As such, the true measure of the property as upheld in the plethora of cases is the market value at the time of the taking when the loss resulted. So, ang dami namin assigned cases sa eminent domain eh. Parang paulit-ulit ko ito narinig na kasi yung laging pinapaglaban nung mga babayaran ng just compensation is kunwari yung expropriation case, it's been going on for 5 years or sabihin natin 10 years, syempre tumaas yung market value ng lupa kasi iba naman yung price ng lupa before. So, laging yung ruling ng Supreme Court ito, lagi niya sinasabi yung statement na I just said, the measure of the property as upheld in the plethora of cases is the market value at the time of the taking when the loss resulted. So in eminent domain or expropriation proceedings, the general rule is that the just compensation to which the owner is entitled to is the market value, which is the sum of money which a person desirous but not compelled to buy and an owner willing but not compelled to sell would agree on as price to be given and received therefore. So the determination of just compensation in eminent domain cases is a judicial function. So tandaan ko natin, judicial function to. The executive department or the legislature may make the initial determinations, but when a party claims a violation of the guarantee in the Bill of Rights, that private property must not be taken for public use without just compensation. No statute, decree, or executive order can mandate that its own determination shall prevail over the court's findings, much less can the courts be precluded from looking into the justness of the decreed compensation. Kailangan talaga just compensation. So, sino ba yung nagde-determine ito? Paano ba natin malalaman yung just compensation? Because it goes through a process. The appointment of at least 3 competent persons as commissioners to ascertain just compensations for the property sought to be taken is a mandatory requirement in our expropriation cases. So, ayun. So, meron naman cases na the government failed to pay just compensation within 5 years from the finality of judgment in the expropriation proceedings. So, the owners concerned shall have the right to recover possession of their property. This is in consonance with the principle that the government cannot keep the property and dishonor the judgment. Without prompt payment, compensation cannot be considered just. So, this is in the case of Republic versus LL.M. So we go now to the delegation to administrative bodies. So I'll just say a precept from a case in Filmstream versus the Court of Appeals. So here, the City of Manila has an undeniable right to exercise its power of eminent domain within its jurisdiction, specifically in pursuit of its urban land reform and housing program. So sinasabi nga na since valid naman delegation to the LGUs, they can practice the power of eminent domain in appropriate proceedings. The taking to be valid must be for public use. There was a time when it was felt that a literal meaning should be attached to such a requirement. Whatever project is undertaken must be for the public to enjoy, as in the case of streets or parks. Otherwise, expropriation is not allowable. It is not so anymore. As long as the purpose of the taking is public, then the power of eminent domain comes into play. As just noted, the Constitution in at least 2 cases to remove any doubt determines what is public use. One is expropriation of lands to be subdivided into small lots for resale at cost to individuals. The other is the transfer to the exercise of this power of utilities and other private enterprises to the government. It is accurate to state that at present, whatever may be beneficially and beneficially employed for the general welfare satisfies the requirements of public use. So we go now to taxation. So taxation is the power of the state to exact contribution or collect taxes from people to raise funds or revenue for the government. So ito yung sinasabing lifeblood of the government. So yung means employed dito is collecting taxes. And yung main purpose is to raise funds for the government. It is a method by which contributions are exacted from persons and property for the support of government and for public needs. So the obligation to pay taxes is a duty natin. So what is the scope? All income earned in the taxing state, whether by citizens or aliens, and all movable and tangible personal properties found in its territory, as well as tangible personal property owned by persons domiciled therein. So the power to tax also includes the power to destroy. When used validly as an implement of the police power in discouraging and in effect ultimately prohibiting certain things or enterprises inimical to public welfare. So, power to destroy. So, for example, sin tax bill, di ba tinataasan yung pag-sell ng cigarettes, ng alcohol. But it also does not include power to destroy. When the tax is used solely for the purpose of raising revenues, it does not include the power to destroy. So, kanina diniscuss natin who may exercise yung Congress, yung President through valid delegation, local legislative bodies. Ano yung limitations ng taxation? We have due process of law, equal protection, and for public purpose. So sa due process, it also has substantial and procedural. So substantial, tax should not be confiscatory except when used as an implement of police power. So procedural naman, due process does not require previous notice and hearing before a law prescribing specific taxes on specific articles may be enacted. However, where the tax to be collected is to be based on the value of the taxable property, the taxpayer is entitled to be notified of the assessment proceedings and to be heard therein on the correct valuation of the property. So sa equal protection naman, there is uniformity. Persons or things belong to the same class shall be taxed at the same rate. Yung requisites dito, standards that are used are substantial and not arbitrary. Yung category is remain to achieve the legislative purpose. The law applies to all, and classification applies equally well to all those belonging to the same class. So equitable taxation, it's based on the capacity to pay. Equality in taxation, tax shall be strictly proportional to the relative value of the property. And progressive system of taxation is that the rate increases as the tax base increases. And lastly, for public purpose, whatever may be beneficially employed for the general welfare. Yung tax naman, sabi ni attorney here, madidiscuss naman siya dun sa subject more sa taxation. So scared to take that subject. Pero yun, so sinabi niya na this will be discussed more in our next semester sa taxation. So, ayun. Kinakabahan ako doon, by the way. So, I will end here first for the first part of the video in Constitutional Law 2. The next video will discuss sections 2, 3, and 4 of the Bill of Rights. It's quite lengthy, so I'll cut it first here. Stay tuned for the next video, and thanks for listening. I hope this helped your Constitutional Law 2 review. Thank you!